On the morning Nigeria broke apart, the sun rose like it always did. Birds still sang. Market women still shouted. Children still laughed. But beneath the calm, a nation was bleeding, and it didn't even know it yet. This is not just a war story. This is the story of broken promises, stolen power, wounded pride, and a country that almost destroyed itself. This is how Africa's most powerful black nation walked into its darkest hour. Nigeria was never meant to be simple. Imagine taking hundreds of nations, thousands of tribes, dozens of religions, and forcing them into one political box. That was Nigeria in 1914, when the British joined the northern and southern protectorates into a single colony. The people were different. Their cultures were different. Their languages were different. But London believed they could be ruled as one. The three biggest ethnic groups dominated everything. The House of Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the west, and the Igbo in the east. Each group had its own political party. Each feared being dominated by the others. And each secretly prepared for the day the peace would break. By the mid-1960s, Nigeria was boiling. Elections were rigged. Politicians were corrupt. Violence filled the streets. To ordinary Nigerians, independence had begun to feel like a lie. The same leaders who promised freedom now stole money and power. Soldiers watched politicians fight like animals, while the people suffered. And then, in January 1966, something shocking happened. Young military officers, mostly Igbo, stormed government buildings, assassinated top politicians, and overthrew Nigeria's civilian government. In one bloody night, the Prime Minister, regional premiers, and senior army officers were killed. The coup failed in parts of the country, but succeeded enough to shatter Nigeria forever. Major General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi, an Igbo, took control of the country. To many Northerners, it looked like an Igbo takeover. And that perception would soon ignite hell. In the north, anger exploded. Rumors spread like wildfire. By July 1966, northern soldiers struck back. They killed Ironsi in a brutal counter-coup and installed Yakubu Gowon, a young northern officer, as head of state. But the violence didn't stop there. Across northern Nigeria, mobs hunted Igbo civilians. Men, women, and children were dragged from homes, trains, and markets, and murdered in cold blood. By the tens of thousands. Blood filled the streets. Families disappeared overnight. Survivors fled south, broken and terrified. The East had seen enough. To the Igbo people, Nigeria had failed them. They were slaughtered for being who they were. The government could not protect them. Their neighbors turned into killers. And their governor, a quiet but determined man named Chukwuemeka Ojimegwu Ojukwu, reached a terrible conclusion. The East could no longer remain in Nigeria. But this was not an easy decision. Breaking away from Nigeria meant war. And Ojukwu knew that if war came, it would be merciless. Yet staying in Nigeria meant waiting to be killed. So the East prepared. On May 30th, 1967, Ojukwu did something that would shake Africa. He stood before the world and declared a new nation. The Republic of Biafra. The eastern region was no longer Nigeria. It was now Biafra. But in Lagos, Gowon was furious. To him, Biafra was not freedom. It was rebellion. And Nigeria would not let its richest region walk away. Oil was the silent monster behind everything. The eastern region sat on Nigeria's oil fields. Losing Biafra meant losing wealth, power, and international influence. So Gowon made a decision that would kill millions. He declared war. On July 6, 1967, Nigerian troops marched toward Biafra. The African giant had turned its guns on itself. At first, Biafra fought back with shocking success. Their soldiers were outnumbered, outgunned, and undertrained, but they had something Nigeria lacked: belief. They were fighting for survival. Biafran troops pushed deep into Nigerian territory, even reaching the outskirts of Lagos. The world watched in shock as the breakaway state refused to die quietly. But Nigeria had something stronger than Biafra's courage. It had the world. Britain backed Nigeria. The Soviet Union backed Nigeria. Egypt trained Nigerian pilots. Western weapons poured in. Biafra, meanwhile, was isolated. No navy. No real air force. No steady supply of weapons. Slowly, Nigeria tightened its grip. A blockade was imposed. Food, medicine, and supplies were cut off from Biafra. And that was when the war became something far more horrifying than bullets. It became starvation. Children began to die. Their bellies swelled. Their eyes sank. Their skin stretched over bones. Mothers watched their babies fade in their arms, powerless to stop it. The images shocked the world. But Nigeria did not lift the blockade. Hunger became a weapon. Biafra was being slowly suffocated. Still, Ojukwu refused to surrender. Even as his people starved. Even as cities fell. Even as the world turned away. He believed Biafra's story was not finished. But in secret, something darker was unfolding. A betrayal was coming. One that would decide the fate of millions. The war did not begin with bombs. It began with silence. Across Biafra, markets slowly emptied. Roads that once carried traders and laughter now carried soldiers and refugees. The skies were quiet too, but not in a peaceful way. It was the silence of something waiting to strike. When Nigeria sealed Biafra off from the outside world, it did not announce it with speeches. It announced it with ships and planes. Warships blocked the coast. Airspace was shut. Food could no longer enter. Medicine could no longer enter. Even letters became dangerous. Biafra was now a cage. And inside that cage lived over 14 million people. At first, many Biafrans believed the blockade would fail. Surely the world would not allow an entire population to starve. Surely Britain, America, or the United Nations would intervene. They were wrong. Weeks passed, then months, and hunger began to crawl into every home. Rice disappeared first, then Gary, then yams, then even cassava. Families ate leaves. They boiled grass. They crushed seeds that were never meant to be eaten. Mothers learned a new way to cry, silently, so their children wouldn't hear the terror in their voices. In the hospitals, doctors faced a nightmare no training could prepare them for. There was no medicine, no antibiotics, no blood. Children arrived with swollen stomachs and thin, fragile limbs. The doctors called it kwashiorkor, a disease caused by protein starvation. But calling it a disease made it sound less cruel than it really was. It was slow murder by hunger. And it was happening everywhere. Nigeria knew exactly what it was doing. This was not just war. This was pressure. The plan was simple. If Biafra could not be defeated with bullets, it would be defeated with empty stomachs. Each day the blockade tightened. The Biafran army grew weaker. Soldiers who once marched proudly now fought on half rations. Some collapsed on the battlefield not from wounds, but from exhaustion and hunger, yet still, they refused to stop. Inside Biafra, propaganda became a lifeline. Radios broadcast songs of hope. Newspapers printed stories of victory, even when cities were falling. Ojukwu appeared on posters, strong and confident, promising that Biafra would survive. And many believed him. They had to. Because believing in Biafra was easier than accepting the truth, that the world had abandoned them. Meanwhile, Nigeria pushed forward. Town after town fell. Village after village was captured. Refugees flooded into the shrinking Biafran territory. Families slept in churches, in schools, under trees. There was no place left to run. The land was filling with people, and with fear. BT, just when Biafra seemed ready to collapse, something unexpected happened. Help came, from the shadows. Night flights began to land on secret airstrips. Planes without national flags. Pilots who did not ask questions. They brought in food, medicine, and sometimes weapons. Some were mercenaries. Some were missionaries. Some were simply men who could not stand by and watch children die. They became known as the Angels of Biafra. But even angels could not stop a nation from bleeding. The war was no longer just about land or politics. It was now about survival. And as hunger grew, so did something even more dangerous: desperation. People began to question Ojukwu. Whispers spread in military camps. Some wondered if the dream of Biafra was worth this suffering. And somewhere, deep within the collapsing nation, a betrayal was taking shape. One that would change everything. The siege was working. Biafra was being strangled. But its final breath had not yet been taken. And the next phase of the war would be even more brutal than the last. Because now, Nigeria was no longer just fighting soldiers. It was fighting time. And time was winning. War changes men long before it changes borders. By the end of 1967, The Nigerian Civil War was no longer a simple fight between two armies. It had become a twisted battlefield of ambition, fear, loyalty, and betrayal. In Biafra, every soldier, every politician, and every starving civilian was now trapped inside a story that was spinning out of control. At the center of it all stood Chukwuemeka Ojimegwu Ojukwu. To his people, he was not just a leader. He was a symbol. The tall, well-spoken, Oxford-educated governor had become the face of Biafran resistance. His voice on the radio kept hope alive. His image on posters reminded people that they were not alone. But behind closed doors, even Ojukwu was beginning to realize how dangerous the situation had become. Biafra was running out of everything. Weapons, fuel, food, time. And Nigeria was closing in. Nigeria's military leadership had learned from its early failures. The surprise Biafran advances of 1967 had humiliated them. Now, they were more organized, more ruthless, and far better supplied. Yakubu Gowon was quiet, calm, and patient. He did not shout about victory. He simply kept sending more troops, more planes, more bombs. His generals knew something Ojukwu feared. Biafra could not survive a long war. So Nigeria turned the conflict into a slow, grinding machine. Every road taken was another throat squeezed. Every town captured was another artery cut. Biafra was being bled dry. As Biafra's army weakened, a strange new group began to appear on the battlefield. White soldiers. They were mercenaries, fighters from Europe and beyond who came not for Nigeria or Biafra, but for money, adventure, and sometimes twisted ideals. Some claimed they were protecting a small nation from a giant. Others just wanted the thrill of war. To starving Biafrans, these men looked like saviors. They flew old fighter jets. They commanded small units. They trained young Biafran boys how to fight. But mercenaries do not fight for love. They fight for payment. And Biafra was running out of money. Inside the Biafran government, tension grew. Some officers wanted to negotiate peace. Some wanted to fight to the death. Some secretly contacted Nigeria. Trust was disappearing. People began to wonder if Ojukwu was telling them the whole truth. Yes, he spoke of victory. But every day more cities fell. More refugees arrived. More children died. Hope was turning into a dangerous illusion. Nigeria's air force now ruled the skies. Bombs fell on markets, on hospitals, on refugee camps. Each explosion was a message. There was nowhere safe in Biafra anymore. The psychological war was as powerful as the physical one. Nigerian planes dropped leaflets promising safety to those who surrendered. Some Biafran soldiers began to slip away at night, crossing into Nigerian lines. Not because they loved Nigeria, but because they were tired of dying. Still, Biafra fought on. Young boys lied about their age to join the army. Old men picked up rifles. Women carried ammunition through forests. This was no longer just a military struggle. It was a people's war. And yet, in the shadows, something ugly was forming. A crack in the heart of Biafra. One of Ojukwu's closest military commanders was a man named Philip Effiong. Loyal, calm, respected. But unlike Ojukwu, Effiong was beginning to see the war in numbers rather than dreams. He saw how many soldiers were left, how much food remained, how little territory Biafra still controlled. And the numbers told a terrifying story. Biafra was dying. Effiong and others started asking a forbidden question. What if continuing the war was worse than surrender? In war, asking that question is dangerous. As 1968 turned into 1969, Biafra was reduced to a small pocket of land. The dream of a proud new nation had become a crowded graveyard of refugees. The mercenaries began to leave. There was no more money, no more fuel, no more glory. The angels in the night still tried to bring food, but Nigerian jets hunted them in the sky. Some planes were shot down. Some pilots never returned. The world was watching, but it was not acting. Ojukwu became more isolated. He trusted fewer people. He spoke less. The burden of leadership was crushing him. He knew that every day he refused to surrender meant more children would starve. Yet surrender meant admitting that Biafra was never real. That all the blood had been for nothing. That kind of truth can break a man. In secret, some Biafran leaders began to talk to Nigeria. Not about victory, but about survival. And when Ojukwu discovered this, It felt like a knife in his back. The war was no longer just against Nigeria. It was now a war inside Biafra itself. And as Nigerian troops prepared for the final push, something shocking was about to happen. Something that would change the course of the war in a single night. The leader of Biafra was about to make a decision that would leave millions in stunned silence. And history would never forgive him for it. The final days of Biafra did not begin with explosions. They began with whispers. In dimly lit rooms, behind closed doors, men spoke in low voices. Maps were spread across tables. Red lines marked where Nigerian troops had advanced. Those red lines were now everywhere. Biafra had shrunk into a thin strip of land no bigger than a large city. Millions were trapped inside it like fish in a drying pond. And in the middle of this shrinking world sat Ojukwu. Once, he had been the proud father of a new nation. Now he was the tired guardian of a dying one. Every report he received was worse than the last. Towns were falling. Soldiers were starving. Children were dying in thousands. Even the radio broadcasts had begun to sound hollow, like echoes from another time. Biafra was collapsing. But surrender was still unthinkable. Ojukwu's greatest fear was not defeat. It was shame. He had promised his people a homeland where they would never be hunted again. He had asked them to sacrifice everything for Biafra. And they had done it. They had given their sons, their daughters, their food, their futures. How could he now tell them it was over? How could he face the mothers who buried their children? How could he face history? But the truth no longer cared about pride. The Nigerian army was days away from the last Biafran strongholds. There was almost no ammunition left. The hospitals had no drugs. The refugees had no food. Even Ojukwu's own guards were growing thin. This was not a government anymore. It was a funeral waiting to happen. Late one night in January 1970, Ojukwu made a decision. Not a public one. Not a heroic one. A secret one. He would leave. Not to surrender. Not to negotiate. To escape. A plane was arranged. Quietly. Quickly. Only a few people knew. Not the soldiers. Not the civilians. Not even many of his own ministers. He told them Biafra would fight on. But Biafra's leader was about to disappear. As dawn approached, Ojukwu boarded a small aircraft and flew out of Biafra into exile. Just like that, the man who created Biafra was gone. No farewell speech. No final address. No explanation. To the millions still starving and fighting, it was as if their father had walked out on them in the middle of the night. When the news spread, it felt unreal. Some refused to believe it. Some felt betrayed. Some felt relieved. Because now, at least, the truth was clear. The war was lost. Ojukwu left behind Philip Effiong to take over what remained of the Biafran government. Effiong had no illusions. He knew there was nothing left to save except lives. He contacted the Nigerian government. For the first time in 3 years, Biafra was ready to surrender. On January 15, 1970, Biafran officials walked into Lagos and formally ended the war. No victory parade. No celebration. Just silence. Nigeria was whole again. But millions were dead. Yakubu Gowon announced a policy of no victor, no vanquished. He promised reconciliation. He promised healing. He promised a new Nigeria. But promises cannot erase graves. The war had destroyed cities. It had destroyed families. It had destroyed trust. And deep in the hearts of the Igbo people, something had been permanently broken. Biafra was gone. But the pain it created was not. And in the ruins of that lost nation, a new and dangerous question began to rise. Did Nigeria truly survive the war? Or did it simply learn how to hide its wounds? When the guns went silent in January 1970, Nigeria did not feel like a country that had just survived a war. It felt like a house after a fire. The walls were still standing, but everything inside was burned. Millions of people stepped out of hiding, out of refugee camps, out of ruined villages, and looked around at what was left. There were no cheers. No relief. Only shock. People who had survived bombs, hunger, and disease now had to survive peace. And peace was not gentle. The Nigerian government declared no victor, no vanquished, but those words were easier to say than to live. In theory, Biafrans were welcomed back into Nigeria. In reality, they returned to a country that did not trust them and did not fully want them. Igbo families went back to their hometowns only to find strangers living in their houses. Businesses they once owned were gone. Land had been taken. Bank accounts were frozen or wiped clean. When former Biafrans tried to withdraw their money, many were given only £20, no matter how much they had before the war. It was not reconciliation. It was humiliation. The people who had suffered the most were expected to smile and move on. They did not. Inside Igbo homes, the war was still alive. Stories of massacres, starvation, and betrayal were passed from parent to child. The world might have turned the page, but in the East, the book was still open. Children grew up knowing they had once belonged to a country called Biafra, a country that was taken from them. Nigeria, meanwhile, was desperate to forget. The government avoided talking about the war. Schools barely taught it. Politicians changed the subject. The nation rushed forward, hoping economic growth and oil money would bury the memories. But trauma does not disappear when it is ignored. It hides and waits. Former Biafran soldiers returned to civilian life with nothing. No jobs, no pensions, no recognition. Some became traders. Some became laborious. Some became criminals. They had fought for a nation that no longer existed, and Nigeria did not know what to do with them. Ojukwu, the man who had started it all, lived in exile for years. When he finally returned, he was a ghost of his former self. The fire that once burned in his eyes had dimmed. Some still called him a hero. Some called him a traitor. History had not yet decided. The scars of the war shaped Nigeria in ways most people never see. Distrust between ethnic groups grew deeper. Politics became more tense. Every crisis carried the shadow of Biafra behind it. The war had ended, but the fear of another one had not. In the East, some people began to whisper again about independence. Not loudly, not yet, but quietly, carefully. The dream of Biafra had been crushed, but it had not died. Because stories do not die just because they are defeated. They wait, and one day they return. Wars do not end when treaties are signed. They end when memories fade. But in eastern Nigeria, the memories never did. Long after the guns fell silent, the name Biafra still floated through homes, through markets, through prayers whispered at night. It was spoken softly, like a secret that could get you in trouble. Parents warned their children to be careful. The government was watching. Talking about Biafra was dangerous, but silence could not erase what people had lived through. The hunger, the bombs, the betrayal. Those things stayed alive in the minds of the survivors. For the Igbo people, the war had left a wound that never healed. They were Nigerians again, yes, but they were Nigerians who had once been hunted inside Nigeria. Every police checkpoint, every political decision, every unfair treatment. It all felt like an echo of 1967, and that echo kept growing louder. Young people who were not even born during the war began to ask questions. Why were our parents so afraid? Why does the government avoid this history? Why does Biafra still make people angry? And the answers they received were filled with pain. They learned about the massacres in the north, about the starvation, about the blockade, about how the world watched and did nothing. To them, Biafra was no longer just a lost war. It was an unfinished story. Nigeria tried to build itself into a modern nation, but it did so on top of broken trust. Ethnic politics never disappeared. Power struggles never stopped. And every time the country faced a crisis, Biafra returned in people's minds like a ghost that refused to rest. Whenever Igbo leaders were excluded, people remembered. Whenever elections felt unfair, people remembered. Whenever violence broke out, people remembered. The war was always there, watching. Some former Biafrans tried to forget. They focused on business, on education, on rebuilding, and many succeeded. The Igbo became one of Nigeria's most hardworking and entrepreneurial groups. But success did not bring peace, because no matter how far they went, they always knew what they had lost. A country. New movements slowly began to rise. They spoke of self-determination, of justice, of Biafra. At first, they were small. But small fires grow. And Nigeria, once again, began to feel that familiar tension beneath its surface. The kind of tension that had once led to war. The tragedy of the Nigerian Civil War was not just that millions died. It was that the reasons they died were never fully resolved. And that made the future dangerous. Because when history is buried instead of healed, it does not disappear. It waits. And one day, it demands to be remembered. Long after the last Nigerian soldier left the shattered towns of the former Biafra, long after the final refugee camp closed, long after the newspapers stopped printing stories about starvation and surrender, the war was still alive. It lived in memories. It lived in silence. It lived in the way people flinched when they heard military boots on concrete. It lived in the way elders paused before speaking about the past. It lived in the way parents warned their children not to ask certain questions. Nigeria had ended the shooting, but it had not ended the pain. And pain, when ignored, becomes something far more dangerous. It becomes anger. In the years after the war, Nigeria tried to rush forward. Oil money poured into government coffers. New roads were built. Lagos grew into a giant city of noise and ambition. The military government spoke of unity and progress, of a strong African nation rising from the ashes. But in the East, progress felt like a story told about someone else. Igbo traders struggled to rebuild their businesses. Professionals who had once been respected were treated with suspicion. Former Biafran soldiers walked the streets like invisible men, carrying memories no one wanted to hear. The message was clear, even if it was never spoken out loud. Forget Biafra. Forget the war. Move on. But how do you forget watching your little sister starve to death? How do you forget burying your father in a shallow grave because bombs were falling? How do you forget a country that once gave you hope? You don't. You pretend. And pretending slowly poisons the soul. In homes across the former Biafra, parents began to tell their children stories late at night. Not the stories taught in school. Not the clean, quiet version of history. They told them about the massacres in the north. They told them about the hunger. They told them about the dream of Biafra. And to these children, Biafra did not sound like a failed rebellion. It sounded like a stolen future. They grew up feeling like they belonged to a nation that did not fully want them. They felt Nigerian on paper, but something else in their hearts. Something unfinished. As decades passed, Nigeria's political system became more chaotic. Military coups came and went. Civilian governments rose and fell. Corruption deepened. Ethnic tension never disappeared. Every time an Igbo person felt cheated by the system, the past whispered. Every time the government seemed unfair, the past whispered. Every time violence erupted, the past whispered. And the whisper always said the same thing: this has happened before. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, a new generation of Igbo youth had grown restless. They had not experienced the war, but they lived with its shadow. They were tired of being told to be quiet about history. They were tired of being treated like second-class citizens. They wanted answers. They wanted dignity. And some of them wanted Biafra back. Groups began to form. They organized meetings. They printed flags. They sang old Biafran songs. At first, they were dismissed as dreamers. But dreams can be powerful when enough people believe them. The name Biafra began to return to Nigerian streets, whispered in rallies, painted on walls, carried in hearts. To some Nigerians, this was dangerous. To others, it was necessary. The government responded the way governments often do when they feel threatened. With force. Activists were arrested. Protests were broken up. Voices were silenced. But repression only made the movement stronger. Because once people feel that their story has been stolen, they will do anything to get it back. Nigeria was no longer fighting Biafra with bombs. It was fighting it with fear. And fear, like hunger, can only hold people for so long. The tragedy of the Nigerian Civil War was not just the millions who died between 1967 and 1970. It was the millions who lived after it, carrying a war that never truly ended inside their minds. And until that war is faced honestly, it will never stop. Nigeria in the 21st century looks nothing like Nigeria in 1967. Skyscrapers now rise where colonial offices once stood. Mobile phones connect villages to the world. Young Nigerians dream of tech startups, music fame, and global success. On the surface, the country is alive with energy and ambition. But beneath that modern shine, old ghosts still walk. And none is more powerful than the ghost of Biafra. In the eastern cities, the red, black, and green flag of the old republic sometimes appears in unexpected places. On car stickers, in small shops, at secret meetings. To outsiders, it looks like nostalgia. To those who carry it, it feels like unfinished business. Young men and women who never saw the war speak of it as if they did. They know the stories. They know the names of the towns that starved. They know the faces of the children from the black and white photographs. For them, Biafra is not history. It is identity. Many of these young people do not hate Nigeria. They simply do not feel protected by it. They see corruption swallow opportunities. They see politicians use ethnicity when it suits them. They see soldiers deployed against protesters instead of criminals. And they ask the same question their grandparents asked decades earlier. Is this really our country? Every crackdown by the government strengthens the movement it is trying to silence. Every arrest turns someone into a martyr. Every denial makes the old wounds deeper. This is the irony of Biafra. The harder Nigeria tries to bury it, the more it refuses to stay underground. But the truth is uncomfortable for everyone. A new Biafra would not be easy. It would face economic, political, and military challenges far worse than those of the 1960s. Borders would be contested. Neighbors would be nervous. The world would not rush to help. Yet the desire for it continues to grow. Not because it is safe, but because it feels just. Nigeria's greatest danger is not another war. It is another ignored truth. Until the pain of 1967 to 1970 is openly faced, taught, and healed, the country will continue to walk with a wound that never closes. Biafra may have lost the battlefield, but it never lost the story. And stories, once planted in the hearts of people, are almost impossible to kill. Every great tragedy leaves behind a question. For Nigeria, that question is simple, but painful. What did all of this mean? More than 3 million people died during the Nigerian Civil War. Not because they chose to fight. Not because they held weapons. But because they were born on the wrong side of a political line. Because their stomachs were emptied by a blockade. Because the world looked away. When the war ended, Nigeria did not hold a national funeral. It did not build monuments to the starving children of Biafra. It did not create a truth commission to tell the full story. It tried to forget. But forgetting is not healing. It is hiding. The first lesson of the war is one most nations never want to admit. When people feel unsafe inside their own country, they will try to escape it. Biafra was not born from ambition alone. It was born from fear. From the memory of neighbors turning into killers. From the knowledge that no one was coming to help. That fear is still alive in many places across Nigeria today. The second lesson is even harder. Hunger is the cruelest weapon of all. Bullets kill quickly. Bombs kill loudly. But starvation kills slowly, quietly, and without mercy. The blockade of Biafra turned food into a battlefield. It punished babies for the decisions of politicians. It made survival a daily lottery. And once a people experience that kind of suffering, they never forget who allowed it to happen. The third lesson is about power. The war showed how quickly leaders will sacrifice ordinary people to protect their control. Oil, territory, and pride were valued more than human life. That truth should disturb every Nigerian. Because if it happened once, it can happen again. And yet, the final lesson of the Nigerian Civil War is not only about cruelty. It is also about resilience. Despite hunger, despite bombs, despite abandonment, millions of Biafrans kept going. They loved. They hoped. They believed in a better future even when everything around them was falling apart. That spirit did not die with Biafra. It lives on. Nigeria today stands at a crossroads. It can continue pretending the past is gone. Or it can face it. Because only by understanding the blood that was spilled can the country ever truly become whole. This war was not just about 1967 to 1970. It was about what kind of nation Nigeria would become. And that story is still being written. The Nigerian Civil War ended over 50 years ago, but its scars are older than the nation itself. They are etched into the soil, the cities, and the hearts of the people. Walk through any eastern city today, and you will see the legacy of the war, not in monuments, but in the stories, the silences, and the tensions that linger like ghosts in every home. Healing a nation after such a catastrophe is not easy. It is not about rebuilding roads or installing electricity. Healing is about confronting the truth, accepting responsibility, and looking into the faces of those who suffered while admitting, honestly, that the price was far too high. For the Igbo people, healing has been complicated. Generations grew up hearing stories of the war not as history, but as living memory. Parents whispered warnings about the North. Children learned that being Nigerian sometimes meant being unsafe. Every success, every triumph, was shadowed by the knowledge that the world had once watched millions die and had done almost nothing. Some argue that the Igbo people healed through achievement. After the war, they poured themselves into education, commerce, and entrepreneurship. Their businesses became pillars of the Nigerian economy. Their universities became centers of excellence. In many ways, they proved their resilience, showing the world that a people who survived famine and bullets could rise again. But resilience is not the same as forgiveness. Healing is not the same as forgetting. Even in the most prosperous Igbo neighborhoods, there are stories that remain untold, wounds that remain unhealed. Families still mourn lost members. Children who were born after the war still carry the burden of stories too horrific to fully comprehend. The Nigerian government, for its part, has made efforts at reconciliation, but they are often superficial. Pledges of no victor, no vanquished were repeated in speeches, yet little was done to restore property, compensate survivors, or integrate former soldiers into society with dignity. Political leaders talk about unity, but systemic inequality and lingering distrust make true reconciliation almost impossible. Meanwhile, the memory of Biafra refuses to die. Movements calling for self-determination occasionally rise, fueled by a mixture of historical grievance and contemporary frustration. Every economic injustice, every political exclusion, every ethnic insult becomes a reminder that the past has not fully been confronted. And in these reminders, the war continues, not in the streets, but in the hearts and minds of millions. On the global stage, the Nigerian Civil War is often remembered in statistics. Millions dead, cities destroyed, famine images that shock the world. But the statistics cannot capture the enduring human trauma. The numbers cannot explain the parents who still cry at night for children who never returned. The numbers cannot describe the elders who quietly remind their communities that history is both a teacher and a warning. Healing, then, is not about erasing the past. It is about telling it honestly, teaching it openly, and building a future where such horrors can never happen again. It is about acknowledging that the nation failed its citizens at their most vulnerable moment, and then working tirelessly to ensure that no Nigerian is ever made to feel expendable. Yet the question remains, can a nation whose very creation was fragile, whose unity has always been fragile, truly heal from a war so devastating that it reshaped its identity? Can a people who have survived betrayal, famine, and slaughter trust again? Can a country born of compromise, rebellion, and violence ever be whole? The answer is not simple. The wounds are deep, the memories vivid, and the consequences of silence long-lasting. But the story of Biafra is also the story of courage, resistance, and hope. It is the story of ordinary people who, even in the face of unthinkable suffering, refuse to give up entirely. Healing, if it comes, will not be quick. It will not be easy. It will not be a single moment or a single policy. It will be the slow work of generations, the honest telling of history, the acknowledgement of wrongs, the building of trust, and the creation of systems that protect every citizen, regardless of ethnicity or region. The ghosts of Biafra still walk among us. They remind Nigeria of what happens when power and ambition outweigh humanity. But they also remind the nation of its greatest potential, the power to endure, to rise, and perhaps, one day, to reconcile. The wounds may never fully disappear, but in the careful acknowledgement of the past, in the protection of the present, and in the cultivation of empathy for the future, there lies the fragile hope that Nigeria, and its people, might one day truly heal. The Nigerian Civil War is often told in statistics, in military strategies, in political speeches. But the truth of the war lives in voices, ordinary voices, echoing from homes, villages, and refugee camps. These are the stories that textbooks leave out, stories of survival, of courage, of heartbreak, and of humanity stretched to its limits. For Amaka, a young girl from Enugu, survival was a matter of hiding in plain sight. She was 10 when the first bombs fell, and the sky above her city turned dark with smoke. Her parents dragged her and her siblings into a small, windowless room, sealing the door with old boards. For days they stayed there, listening to the screams and the marching of soldiers outside. Amaka remembers tasting her own tears when there was no food left. By the time they emerged, half their neighborhood had vanished. Families they had known for generations were gone, swallowed by the chaos. Yet she survived, and later, she would tell her children that courage sometimes comes in the quietest of acts, holding a frightened little brother's hand while the world outside is burning. In the villages of the Niger Delta, men like Obi faced the impossible choice between joining the Biafran army or being massacred by advancing Nigerian troops. He fought because surrender meant death. He fought because leaving the land of his ancestors was unthinkable. Yet the war demanded sacrifices beyond imagining. He watched friends starve, mothers bury their children, and churches turned into graves. Every victory on the battlefield felt hollow when the faces of starving civilians haunted him at night. Survival was no triumph, it was endurance. Then there were those like Nkem, a nurse in one of Biafra's collapsing hospitals. Medicine had run out. Antibiotics were non-existent. Children with swollen bellies died in her arms, their tiny bodies no longer able to digest the meager rations she could beg for. Every day she made choices she never should have had to make. Who would get the last bit of milk? Who would be left to fade? Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with helplessness. And yet, she kept working, kept soothing, kept comforting the dying, because in the midst of a war, even small acts of humanity became heroic. The stories of survival are not always about heroism. Some are about cunning. Like Chijioke, a young boy who escaped a massacre by pretending to be dead. He lay in the mud for hours while soldiers searched for bodies, his lungs aching, his ears ringing with gunfire and screams. When night finally fell, he crawled toward safety, only to be swallowed by another danger, hunger. 4 days, he survived on leaves, fruits, and rainwater. By the time he reached a refugee camp, he had become a living ghost, carrying memories that would never leave him. Refugee camps themselves became microcosms of human resilience and despair. People built shelters from whatever scraps they could find: torn fabric, corrugated iron, broken wood. Children played in mud, oblivious to the death surrounding them, while parents calculated how to stretch a handful of cassava to feed 10 mouths. Disease ran rampant, and yet people clung to hope, praying for food, for safety, for the return of a peace that had long vanished. Every survivor was a testament to the human spirit, even as the world largely ignored their suffering. Then there were the voices of those who lost everything. Elderly men who had once owned farms and shops wandered the streets, speaking of past lives in hushed, haunted tones. Women who had been widowed by bombs or bullets carried the trauma in silence, their grief a quiet but constant companion. Children born during the war knew only hunger and fear, yet they adapted, learned, and survived, carrying the legacy of endurance in their bones. Even amidst such horror, there were stories of courage that defy imagination. Local communities often risked their own lives to hide neighbors fleeing massacres. Strangers shared the little food they had. Midwives delivered babies with no tools, no medicines, and no hope of official help. These acts of humanity punctuated the darkness of the war, proving that even in its worst moments, Biafra was full of life and hope. What connects all these voices is memory. Every survivor carries the war inside them, sometimes in ways they cannot articulate. Sleep is haunted by the cries of children. Smells of smoke and burning flesh linger decades later. The war lives in the choices they were forced to make, choices that no human should ever face. And as they tell their stories to younger generations, they ensure that the lessons of survival, the costs of neglect, and the value of human life are never forgotten. These voices remind us that war is not just about soldiers and generals. It is about mothers, fathers, children, and neighbors. It is about the countless ordinary people who bore the brunt of decisions made far above their heads. And in listening to them, we begin to understand the true depth of what was lost, not just in Biafra, but in the heart of Nigeria itself. The Nigerian Civil War, for all its political and military narratives, is ultimately the story of these people, of the ones who survived, of the ones who died, and of the generations who carry their memory forward. Every life affected, every family broken, every child starved, and every act of courage is a thread in the vast, complicated tapestry of a nation that nearly tore itself apart. When Biafra declared independence in 1967, it was not only a challenge to Nigeria's territorial integrity, it was also a challenge to the world. The war that followed was devastating, not only for those on the ground but also for global perception. Millions of people were dying in a country most of the world barely understood. And yet, the world's reaction was, at best, cautious, at worst, indifferent. In the beginning, Biafra hoped for recognition. The fledgling nation sent envoys to Europe, Africa, and the Americas, pleading for support. They argued that their people were under siege, that mass atrocities were being committed, and that urgent action was necessary. Some countries, like Gabon, Tanzania, and Ivory Coast, extended limited recognition, but none were powerful enough to change the course of the war. The United Nations refused to intervene, citing Nigeria's sovereignty as the paramount concern. Western powers were particularly conflicted. Britain, Nigeria's former colonial master, had significant oil interests in the eastern region. British companies had long invested in oil fields, refineries, and infrastructure. Supporting Biafra would risk destabilizing the region and threatening British profits. As a result, the United Kingdom threw its support firmly behind Nigeria, providing weapons, military advisors, and logistical aid. To Biafra, this felt like betrayal. The former colonial ruler, the nation that had carved Nigeria's borders, had chosen money and influence over human lives. France, on the other hand, maintained a more complicated position. French companies also had oil interests, but France occasionally provided covert support to Biafra, particularly in the form of arms shipments and mercenary pilots. These small gestures, while symbolically significant, were insufficient to turn the tide of war. In the end, they offered hope but not salvation. The United States, caught in the throes of the Cold War, largely remained neutral. While American public opinion was horrified by images of starving children, policymakers feared jeopardizing relations with Nigeria, a nation rich in oil and strategically located in Africa. Appeals from humanitarian organizations clashed with the geopolitical priorities of superpowers. American newspapers printed heart-wrenching photos of malnourished children, but in Washington, decisions were made that prioritized politics over people. Meanwhile, the media played a complicated role. Photographs of emaciated children in Biafra shocked the world and became some of the most iconic images of 20th century humanitarian crises. Organizations like the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and the Joint Church Aid-funded relief program sent what aid they could, but the Nigerian blockade limited deliveries. International outrage grew, but outrage alone could not stop the machines of hunger and war. The blockade, enforced by Nigeria with the tacit consent of global powers, became a devastating weapon. No country had the political will to challenge it decisively. Relief flights were often turned away or sabotaged. Convoys attempting to deliver food, medicine, and supplies risked interception or bombing. And yet, the moral outrage simmered quietly in Europe and America, filtered through newsreels, articles, and activist campaigns. One of the most tragic dimensions of international response was the delayed mobilization of humanitarian aid. While the famine was publicized, bureaucracies, red tape, and political caution slowed actual interventions. By the time meaningful relief arrived in some areas, entire communities had already perished. Children had starved. Families had been obliterated. And yet, the world claimed it could do little because sovereignty and politics were more important than suffering. Some individuals acted heroically. Journalists risked their lives to document the atrocities. Missionaries provided food, shelter, and care at the cost of personal safety. Doctors improvised treatment in unsanitary, dangerous conditions. Airplanes flew supplies under cover of darkness. These people became the lifeline for Biafra, and in many ways, their courage prevented the death toll from being even higher. But their efforts were small compared to the scale of the devastation. The silence of major powers was deafening. The war revealed an uncomfortable truth about international politics. Human lives are often subordinate to political and economic interests. Nigeria's strategic importance, its oil wealth, and the fear of setting a precedent for secession in Africa all contributed to the world hesitancy. Biafra, desperate and alone, became a lesson in how the international system fails civilians in the midst of political conflicts. Yet, despite the lack of intervention, the war forced the world to reconsider humanitarian action in the decades that followed. Biafra became a blueprint for future crises, influencing international responses in Ethiopia, Sudan, Rwanda, and beyond. The images of starving children, the personal stories of loss, and the advocacy of humanitarian organizations transformed global consciousness. The war may have ended in silence for Biafra, but it was a wake-up call to the world about the consequences of inaction. The international silence was both a weapon and a wound. It reinforced Nigeria's blockade strategy, accelerated Biafra's demise, and left millions feeling abandoned by the world. Survivors often recount the bitter irony. Their suffering was seen and photographed, yet no powerful nation acted to save them. This truth became part of the collective memory, a reminder that survival sometimes depends not on justice, but on the alignment of global interests. Biafra's plea for help echoes even today as a cautionary tale. It asks uncomfortable questions. How does the world respond when politics collides with humanity? How many children must starve before nations act? How does a people recover from abandonment by both their own country and the international community? In the end, the international response, or lack thereof, added a layer of tragedy to a conflict that was already catastrophic. Biafra's story became a lesson not just about war, but about the moral responsibility of nations and the consequences of turning a blind eye to human suffering. And as future generations look back, the question remains hauntingly clear. When the world stayed silent, who truly lost the most? The true horror of the Nigerian Civil War was never captured fully in maps, statistics, or political debates. It was seen in the faces of the starving. It was heard in the cries of children. It was felt in the relentless despair that spread through Biafra like a shadow that would not leave. The humanitarian crisis was not a byproduct of war. It was its weapon, its signature, and its defining tragedy. By late 1968, Biafra was running on empty. Not just empty warehouses or empty city streets, but empty stomachs. Families rationed every morsel. Mothers cooked leaves and ground seeds in hopes of feeding their children. They told themselves that hunger could be endured, that malnutrition could be outlasted. But the truth was relentless. There was simply not enough calories, not enough protein, not enough hope. Children were the most vulnerable. Kwashiorkor, a disease caused by severe protein deficiency, became a daily reality. Hospitals overflowed with small, fragile bodies. Swollen bellies, thin limbs, and pale skin were everywhere. Nurses and doctors, few in number and overwhelmed by the scale of suffering, could do little beyond documenting the toll. The images of children with skeletal limbs and distended stomachs would later become the iconic, haunting photographs of the war. They were more than images. They were cries for help the world largely ignored. Yet amid the suffering, survival demanded courage. Families formed networks of care, sharing what little food they had. Neighbors protected each other from marauders or soldiers, often at great personal risk. Women walked for miles with infants strapped to their backs in search of water or maize. In remote villages, local leaders organized food distribution, even as the rations were pitiful and barely enough to keep people alive. Humanity persevered, even when hope seemed impossible. Starvation was only part of the crisis. Disease followed hunger closely. Cholera, dysentery, and measles ravaged refugee camps and makeshift hospitals. Every outbreak claimed hundreds, sometimes thousands. Relief agencies tried to intervene, but the Nigerian blockade limited access. Food deliveries were often intercepted or delayed. Medicine and clean water were scarce. Every day, the war silently claimed more victims than bullets ever could. Pregnant women faced impossible choices. With no proper nutrition, childbirth became a risk of death for both mother and child. Midwives delivered babies with bare hands, improvised instruments, and prayers. For some, survival was miraculous. For others, tragedy struck silently. Families buried children in shallow graves or in improvised cemeteries, the names often lost to time. Each death was a private agony, yet collectively it became the haunting of a nation. The crisis created moral dilemmas as well. When food arrived, whether from local sources or clandestine airlifts, decisions had to be made about distribution. Who would eat first? Who would be left with nothing? Parents were forced to choose between children. Soldiers had to decide between feeding the wounded or the healthy. These impossible choices left scars deeper than hunger itself, searing trauma into everyone's memory. Even among adults, survival often required ingenuity and courage. Men hunted in forests for small game, risking capture or death. Women made alcohol from fermented grains to use as currency in barter. Communities improvised. They recycled scraps. They boiled tree bark. They prayed. And yet, no matter how clever or resourceful they were, the scale of deprivation was crushing. Despite the despair, there were moments of fragile hope. Relief flights at night brought small amounts of food and medicine. Missionaries and aid workers braved dangerous conditions to offer care. Villagers formed networks to share resources. Even in the midst of unimaginable suffering, acts of solidarity and bravery emerged, proving the resilience of the human spirit. These were the tiny victories that allowed people to endure, the threads of life that held communities together in the face of annihilation. The humanitarian crisis was not merely a consequence of war, it was a testament to the world's failures. Biafra's suffering was visible, documented, and undeniable. Yet major powers prioritized political alliances, oil interests, and fear of precedent over intervention. Millions of people, most of them innocent, were left to fend for themselves against starvation, disease, and displacement. In the end, the faces of starvation and survival tell the story of Biafra more powerfully than maps or speeches ever could. They reveal the cost of war when civilians are deliberately targeted, when politics outweighs humanity, and when the world hesitates to act. Every child who survived, every mother who protected her family, every community that found a way to endure became a living witness to both horror and resilience. The humanitarian crisis of the Nigerian Civil War is a stark reminder. War does not begin or end with generals and treaties. It begins and ends with human lives. And the memories of those lives, whether they survived or perished, continue to haunt Nigeria and the world, demanding that the lessons of Biafra never be forgotten. The Nigerian Civil War was not just fought on battlefields. It was fought in markets, in kitchens, and in the bellies of children. By 1968, the Nigerian government had perfected a weapon more devastating than guns, more lethal than bombs: starvation. The blockade of Biafra was not an accident, nor a byproduct of war. It was a calculated strategy, a means to an end, and a demonstration of how hunger could be used as a weapon of war. From the very beginning, Nigeria understood that Biafra's strength was not only in its army, but in its people. The soldiers fought bravely, but civilians provided the sustenance, the labor, and the spirit of the resistance. Cut off their food, break their towns, spread fear among their families, and the army would follow. It was a cruel arithmetic, but one that Nigeria executed with relentless precision. Ports were sealed. Major roads were blocked. Rivers that had once carried trade and life were now patrolled by military vessels. Airspace was closed. Relief convoys faced gunfire and bureaucratic obstruction. Food shipments from the international community were delayed or diverted. Medicine, clothing, and fuel became rare commodities. Slowly, Biafra's population was being strangled, not by bullets, but by absence. The human toll was staggering. Estimates suggest that over 1 million people, mostly children, died from starvation or starvation-related diseases during the blockade. Parents watched helplessly as their children grew weaker day by day. Mothers fed children leaves, boiled tree bark, and diluted every scrap of food to prolong life. Fathers hunted or scrounged, often risking their lives in areas controlled by Nigerian forces. Communities rationed every morsel, but the famine continued to tighten its grip. Hospitals became impossible places. Doctors faced ethical dilemmas that no human being should endure. Who would receive the last handful of rice? Who would be denied? Blood transfusions were impossible, and antibiotics were rare. Children with swollen bellies and sunken eyes became daily realities. Adults, weakened by hunger, fell ill to minor diseases that would have been survivable under normal circumstances. Death became routine, yet no one spoke of it publicly. The horror of famine was quieter than war, but far more relentless. The blockade was also psychological warfare. The constant threat of starvation broke morale. Families lived in constant fear, not of soldiers, but of the day the food ran out. Communities began to crumble under the strain. Soldiers deserted the army to return to starving families. People hid their children in hope they could be spared. Hunger became an instrument of obedience, fear, and despair. Yet even in the darkest hours, resilience shone. Relief operations, often led by international volunteers or missionaries, attempted nighttime airlifts and secret convoys. People dug hidden storage areas, cultivated small gardens where possible, and shared whatever they had. In small villages, neighbors pooled resources. In some cases, communal efforts ensured that a few children survived where they otherwise would not have. These acts of survival were heroic in a quiet, almost invisible way, and they became a testament to human courage in the face of unimaginable cruelty. International observers were horrified, yet largely paralyzed. Newspapers published shocking photographs of starving children with distended stomachs and fragile limbs. Aid organizations pleaded for access. Yet global powers hesitated to act decisively. Political alliances, economic interests, and fear of encouraging secession outweighed moral outrage. The world watched, often silently, as famine continued to spread through Biafra like a slow-moving shadow. The use of starvation as a weapon was a grim innovation in modern warfare. Biafra's plight became a case study in how hunger can be deployed strategically, with devastating efficiency. It also revealed the horrifying truth that civilians, especially children, often bear the heaviest burden of conflict. In Biafra, the hunger was not incidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and as lethal as any armed assault. Yet, despite the cruelty of the blockade, the people of Biafra endured. They survived through ingenuity, determination, and the solidarity of communities bound together by shared suffering. The blockade may have destroyed their cities, starve their children, and weaken their armies, but it did not entirely crush the human spirit. It became, instead, a testament to resilience, courage, and the brutal lessons of war. The blockade of Biafra remains one of the darkest chapters in 20th century history, a stark reminder of how modern warfare can target civilians as part of a strategic objective. It forces us to ask difficult questions. What is the cost of sovereignty? How should the world respond to deliberate starvation? And, ultimately, what does it mean for humanity when hunger is turned into a weapon? In war, children are never the collateral damage. They are the victims who suffer most deeply, who pay the highest price, and whose lives are shaped forever by forces they cannot control. In Biafra, children were the silent witnesses of a nation in collapse. They were born into hunger, into fear, into a world where death and survival danced together with terrifying intimacy. By 1968, Biafra was experiencing one of the most devastating famines of the 20th century. Children's stomachs were swollen from malnutrition, their bodies frail, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Kwashiorkor and marasmus became familiar terms, not just for doctors but for families who watched helplessly as their youngest struggled to survive. Every day was a gamble between life and death. Parents rationed what little food they had, often choosing to feed the older children in the hope that they could at least survive long enough to carry the family name forward. The youngest was sometimes left to fade, a tragic arithmetic of desperation. Yet amid this horror, the children adapted in ways adults could hardly imagine. They scavenged for scraps, gathered wild fruits, fished in shallow rivers, and even helped plant small gardens in hidden corners. Some walked miles to collect water or firewood, all while carrying younger siblings on their backs. They became small soldiers of survival, resilient not because of choice, but because circumstances demanded it. Many children were also witnesses to violence that no child should ever see. Bombs fell on towns while they slept. Soldiers looted their homes. Entire families disappeared in a single night. Some children hid in dark corners or shallow graves to survive attacks. Others were forced to leave their homes and travel hundreds of kilometers with parents, siblings, or strangers, seeking safety in refugee camps where disease and hunger were waiting for them. Each child who survived carried scars, both physical and psychological, that would last a lifetime. Education, once a cornerstone of Igbo society, was disrupted entirely. Schools closed, teachers fled, and classrooms became shelters for the displaced. A generation of children grew up learning less from books and more from survival. Yet even in these conditions, learning persisted in unexpected ways. Children observed, adapted, and absorbed lessons about resilience, strategy, and human behavior that no curriculum could provide. They learned to read the signs of approaching soldiers, the patterns of air raids, and the rhythms of scarcity. Some children became symbols of the war itself. Photographs of emaciated infants and toddlers, eyes wide with hunger and fear, circulated internationally and became icons of Biafra's suffering. The world saw the human cost, yet it could not intervene fast enough. These children became faces of tragedy, proof that war's cruelty is measured in innocents stolen and lives interrupted. In refugee camps, survival required communal effort. Older children took care of younger ones, sharing the last bits of food, offering comfort when adults could not. They formed bonds that were both lifelines and lifetimes in the making. Some became reluctant leaders, organizing play, keeping order, or helping distribute aid. In the face of starvation, fear, and death, children displayed maturity far beyond their years. Yet not all survived. Thousands perished quietly, unrecorded, leaving only the memory in parents' hearts. Their absence created a generation of lost siblings, friends, and neighbors. Families mourned silently, sometimes burying children in mass graves. Each death was a painful reminder of the war's cruel arithmetic. Survival was not guaranteed, and childhood was a fragile luxury. For those who did survive, the war shaped every aspect of life. They carried trauma, resilience, and an acute awareness of injustice into adulthood. Many became leaders, activists, and storytellers, determined to ensure that Biafra's lessons would not be forgotten. Their survival became both a personal triumph and a collective responsibility, to remember, to educate, and to fight for a better future. The children of Biafra, though marked by suffering, became a testament to the human spirit. They remind us that even in the darkest times, resilience can grow. They reveal the cost of war in human terms, beyond numbers and borders. And they leave us with an urgent question. How do we honor a generation that survived hunger, violence, and neglect while the world watched largely in silence? Their faces, stories, and memories are not just relics of the past. They are warnings, lessons, and inspiration. The children of Biafra endured what most adults could not imagine, and in doing so, they ensured that the history of the war, its horrors, and its heroism would live far beyond the battlefield. The Nigerian Civil War was not just fought with guns, bombs, and starvation. It was also fought in the court of public opinion. And nowhere was this more evident than in the role of the media. Photographs, newspaper reports, and documentaries brought the horrors of Biafra into living rooms around the world, shocking audiences and exposing the devastating human cost of a conflict that many in the West barely understood. Images of starving children with swollen bellies, skeletal limbs, and hauntingly vacant eyes became the war's most enduring symbols. Photographers risked their lives to capture these moments, crawling through mud, navigating military checkpoints, and entering bombed-out towns. Their cameras became witnesses to a tragedy that was otherwise invisible to the world. For many, these images were not just photographs, they were a call to conscience. They revealed suffering that words alone could not convey. International newspapers printed these photos on front pages, eliciting shock, pity, and outrage. Editors debated how graphic the content should be, knowing that images of starving infants would provoke strong reactions. Some publications censored the most harrowing pictures, others published them without restraint. Yet regardless of approach, the message was clear. Biafra was dying, and the world was watching. Television networks began covering the conflict, though limited by technology and access. Video footage, often grainy and raw, showed desperate mothers carrying malnourished children, crowded refugee camps, and devastated villages. Viewers in Europe, North America, and parts of Africa could see what aid agencies were trying to describe. Famine and war intertwined, civilian populations decimated, and the suffering seemingly endless. These images created empathy, but they also created a sense of helplessness. How could anyone stop the slow, silent slaughter happening thousands of miles away? Journalists' reports were equally critical. They told stories of parents forced to ration food to near starvation, of midwives delivering babies with no instruments or medicine, of soldiers deserting the army to care for dying families. First-hand accounts detailed the psychological toll on children who had witnessed death at every turn. These reports were visceral, often breaking through the political and cultural barriers that might have otherwise distanced audiences from the reality of Biafra. Yet despite media coverage, the response from governments was muted. Photos of emaciated children shocked public opinion, sparked charity campaigns, and prompted some private donations, but geopolitical considerations often outweighed humanitarian concerns. Nations prioritized alliances, oil interests, and political stability over intervention. The media succeeded in raising awareness, but it could not compel the international system to act decisively. The images were powerful, but their power was limited by politics. Still, the media had a profound impact on the course of humanitarian aid. Organizations like the Red Cross, UNICEF, and Médecins Sans Frontières were galvanized into action. Airlifts were organized, medical teams deployed, and small but significant amounts of food reached starving populations. The media helped apply pressure, even if indirectly, highlighting the crisis and making it impossible for the world to ignore entirely. Humanitarianism, in this context, became inseparable from journalism. Beyond international audiences, media coverage also influenced local morale. In Biafra, leaflets, radio broadcasts, and photographs became symbols of resistance and survival. They reminded people that the world had not entirely forgotten them, even if aid was slow and limited. These messages carried hope, as small as it might have been, into villages, refugee camps, and hospitals. People clung to the notion that their suffering was visible, that they were being witnessed, and that perhaps the world would act. The war also created ethical dilemmas for journalists. How much should they intervene versus observe? Were they witnesses or participants? Photographers debated whether taking a photo of a starving child was exploitation or essential documentation. Some were criticized for sensationalizing suffering, while others were lauded for their courage and honesty. These debates set the stage for future conflicts, establishing frameworks for war reporting and humanitarian journalism for decades to come. Ultimately, the media's role in Biafra demonstrates the power and limitations of images. They can shock, provoke, and inspire, but they cannot, by themselves, stop war. They can bring a crisis into the global consciousness, but they cannot force nations to act if strategic interests dominate moral imperatives. The starving children of Biafra were seen, and their suffering was recorded, but for too long, the response was insufficient. Yet, without the media, the story of Biafra might have been entirely forgotten. The photographs, reports, and documentaries preserve the memory of the conflict, ensuring that the world could never entirely claim ignorance. They transformed private agony into public awareness, leaving a permanent imprint on global consciousness and shaping the way future humanitarian crises were reported. The media did not end the war, nor did it save all the lives it captured, but it ensured that Biafra would never be invisible. It made the world confront the consequences of political decisions, military strategies, and international indifference. It immortalized both the horror and the humanity of a nation fighting to survive under impossible circumstances. The Nigerian Civil War, though officially over in January 1970, left a legacy that continues to shape the nation to this day. Its impact was not confined to battlefields or political decisions. It seeped into every facet of Nigerian society, from governance and ethnic relations to culture, memory, and identity. To understand Nigeria today, one must understand the war and its enduring shadows. Politically, the war reinforced ethnic divisions and distrust. The attempted secession of Biafra exposed deep fractures in Nigeria's federal system. The East felt marginalized and betrayed. The North and West often viewed the East with suspicion. Even decades later, these divisions influenced politics, elections, and national discourse. Policies aimed at unifying the country were often superficial, as underlying grievances remained unaddressed. The war taught Nigerians that unity, while necessary, could be fragile, conditional, and sometimes enforced through fear. Socially, the human cost was immense. Millions died from fighting, starvation, and disease. Families were fractured, communities destroyed, and generations traumatized. Survivors carried the psychological scars of what they had endured, passing trauma onto their children. Trust between ethnic groups suffered. Intermarriage, migration, and political cooperation were hampered by memories of violence. Yet, amidst the trauma, resilience emerged. The Igbo people, in particular, rebuilt their lives through education, commerce, and entrepreneurship, demonstrating remarkable determination to survive and thrive despite the odds. Culturally, the war left indelible marks. Stories of Biafra, the famine, the battles, the courage, and the loss became central to collective memory. Literature, music, film, and oral histories preserved the experiences of survivors, ensuring that the lessons of the war were never forgotten. The images of starving children, the letters of soldiers, and the testimonies of displaced families continue to educate new generations about the human cost of conflict. Biafra became more than a failed secession. It became a symbol of endurance, injustice, and the necessity of remembering history. The humanitarian dimension also reshaped Nigeria and the world. The war exposed the devastating consequences of famine and the deliberate targeting of civilians. International awareness of the crisis prompted changes in how the global community approaches humanitarian interventions. Relief organizations, inspired or pressured by media coverage, developed strategies for addressing starvation, displacement, and disease in war zones, a legacy that influenced aid responses in subsequent African conflicts and beyond. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the war lies in memory itself. Biafra remains alive in the hearts of many Nigerians, particularly in the East. The war is not just history. It is identity, cautionary tale, and warning. The questions it raised, about governance, inclusion, justice, and the value of human life, remain unresolved, ensuring that the story of Biafra continues to inform contemporary debates about Nigeria's future. In sum, the Nigerian Civil War was more than a military conflict. It was a profound national tragedy with enduring political, social, and cultural repercussions. It exposed the fragility of unity, the dangers of ethnic and political exclusion, and the human cost of indifference, both internal and international. Yet it also revealed extraordinary resilience, communities that rebuilt, children who survived, and stories that refused to be forgotten. The legacy of Biafra is thus both a warning and a testament, a warning of what happens when humanity is sidelined in favor of politics, and a testament to the endurance, courage, and hope that persists even in the darkest hours. Nigeria carries these lessons in its identity, and the world carries them in its conscience. The Nigerian Civil War ended in 1970, but its story is eternal, etched in memory, preserved in culture, and alive in every voice that refuses to forget.